Hey all, here at OS Reviews. You're watching our retro throwback of the original Blackberry Torch here in 2018. This was a phone that was released in 2010. It was the first phone for BlackBerry that combined a slider, QWERTY keyboard, and a touchscreen display. Now, the first all-touch smartphone from BlackBerry was the Storm, but that had a very controversial screen that physically depressed that some people liked, some people didn't, and this was a more conventional touchscreen that had also a slider form factor, kind of like the Priv as we know it today. So this ran on the BlackBerry OS 6.0. It was updated to OS 7 and had a single-core 624 MHz processor, 512 megabytes of RAM, and 4 gigs of built-in storage, along with a 3.2-inch display. So here's the original packaging. You can see some of the information printed on the back, rim, and if we open it up, we have the phone right on top, which we'll take a closer look at in a second. Underneath this, we have access to the various pamphlets and documentations, as well as a charging cable, which is simply using micro USB. Even back then, 3.2 inches was more of a compact touchscreen device. Phones like the iPhone had a 3.5-inch display for comparative bases, and later on we also saw the HTC HD2, which had a 4.3-inch screen. So by comparison, it was a more petite handset. Still, it looked pretty good in terms of the design, thanks in large part with the chrome as well as aluminum and soft touch accents that brought a touch of a more premium design to the BlackBerry Torch. On top, there's a earpiece, but no front-facing camera, and below here there is an optical trackpad along with a multitasking key, a back key, talk and end key that dubs as a power key. On the edge there is a micro USB port for charging, and if we slide it up, we have access to that classic BlackBerry keyboard. This is spring assisted, so it opens and closes with a satisfying thump, and we have access to a full 4 rows as well as these slanted layouts that are tactile and responsive. Even though this is far from being the largest QWERTY keyboard on the market, even for a BlackBerry handset, it still offered a very nice typing experience and could often get more precise input than touchscreen devices of the time. And on the top, there's also a mute as well as a lock for the touchscreen. On the back, there was access to a 5.0 megapixel autofocus enabled camera with LED flash, and behind the back cover, there was also access to a micro SD card slot for expanding the built-in memory. With the phone turned on, we're greeted to the classic BlackBerry OS, which includes a row of commonly used applications that are sorted by various categories like media, favorites, all, frequent, as well as downloads. I can also drag up to have access to a full tray of apps, which I can then scroll through. There's definitely an elegant simplicity to BlackBerry OS, even if it doesn't offer the same vast collection of apps as the Google Play Store or the iOS Store on more popular platforms. But it kind of reminds me of Palm's WebOS in that sense. It's a device that offers an alternative in terms of the mobile OS experience. There's also universal search on the top here, which was quite useful. It also brought up this on-screen keyboard if you wanted to use this in lieu of the hardware keyboard that you could swipe up like so. So if we do a quick search for something like, for instance, the camera, you can see it will pop up with both relevant apps as well as web searches that you can integrate into. So this was quite convenient. Time and date as well as status information when we're on the top, and I can also tap on this to manage things like Wi-Fi, Bluetooth as a drag down notification shade of sorts. So speaking of, let's take a quick look at the camera experience. At 5 megapixels, it's perhaps one of the only specs that don't seem completely outdated in 2018. There are still plenty of budget as well as mid-end Android phones that still have just 5 megapixels for the resolution. And of course, the quality of an image can't be judged solely on the megapixel count alone. The interface of the Torch is actually pretty simple. We have access to a digital viewfinder. There's also access to things like geotagging. We can also turn on and off the flash, as well as scene detection modes. So this is the auto mode. There's also a face detection mode along with others for landscapes, party, close-up, snow, beach, night, and text. So there are quite a few of these options that BlackBerry gave you. In the gallery, we're able to take a look back at some of these shots. You can see that there's actually a good amount of detail, and there is, of course, pinch-to-zoom support. It's not the most responsive or lucid, but it is something that works. You can see that the text as well as finer details are definitely soft around the edges, but overall colors are still pretty accurate and natural looking. Something I do like, going back to the Torch, is the slightly rounded corners on the edges of the display. Again, something that reminds me a bit of Palm OS, and there are more and more modern phones today with edge-to-edge displays that also has rounded corners. It doesn't do anything as far as functionality is concerned, but just adds a bit more of an elegant touch, in my opinion. And here are some other shots that were captured outside that you get a better sense of the overall experience. And here's one indoors with the flash turned on. As a whole, again, the camera experience really isn't bad. For a phone that is 8 years old, they're more than usable, and some of these shots can still be fully shared onto social media without any issues. Now, one of the reasons why you might be even watching this video is perhaps you've seen this device, the BlackBerry Torch, floating around on Amazon or eBay, although I personally wouldn't recommend rushing out and getting one today just because it is so outdated in terms of software, as well as many apps perhaps not running at all, and if they do, very slowly compared to a modern day phone. But as a backup device, if you're only making phone calls, occasionally browsing the web, sending a few text messages, then there are perhaps a few reasons why you would consider a device like this. For one, again, it would be price. If you can find one in refurbished condition online for around $20, sometimes as low as only $15, it is definitely one of these cheapest smartphones that you can currently find online. So that is one reason to consider. All right, so next, if we jump into the web browsing experience, let's take a quick look at that. This is using the BlackBerry Browser, which was never known for being very powerful even back in the day, but with a touchscreen interface, it made overall navigation slightly better. We're first going to just jump into YouTube and take a quick look at the speaker quality. And surprisingly, mobile versions of sites will still load. We also have this optical mouse that acts as a cursor for more precise navigation. The only downside is really the size of the screen, which is quite small by today's standards. Interestingly, BlackBerry decided to put the speaker on the very edge of the phone, which is a little bit hard to actually find, but at the very least it's hard to get muffled up. Still, it's not a stereo speaker, but it packs sufficient volume for listening to quick music and for watching clips on YouTube. It's not very rich, it's not nearly high fidelity or matches something like the boom sound on HTC One phones, but as a whole, not a bad speaker at all. Again, it's a little bit surprising that most YouTube clips will still load up without any problems. Now, the biggest downside is, of course, this resolution of the screen isn't very high, so you're only able to watch them up to 360p, and that will get you plenty of pixelation if you're watching back on videos. Definitely not very sharp, but as a whole, it's still very quick to load thanks to the fact that it is relatively low resolution, even using this browser, which on paper should be very outdated today. There are quite a few built-in apps that comes with BlackBerry OS. For instance, under Applications, we have access to a memo pad. Also, we have Slideshow and Sheets to Go, as well as Word to Go. It allows us to view as well as edit Word, Excel, and PowerPoint documents directly on the phone. It actually makes sense since BlackBerry has always been more targeted at corporates as well as professionals, those who want to do more productivity when on the road and would want to access some of these apps for presentations, things like that. And this is also the multitasking key that allows us to switch applications in this tray layout. Not a fancy animation, but it's functional and allows us to jump back and forth between apps that we have currently open in the background. And surprisingly, for a phone, again, with only 512 megabytes of RAM, it seems to keep up with some of these older apps without too many problems. Other elements, including the phone call quality, have never really changed. This is a 3G phone, however, and not 4G LTE supported, so it only works now with the T-Mobile here in the US if you get it unlocked. But phone call quality is generally pleasing just because reception quality is good, and the microphone is also noise canceling, so even outdoors it seems to do a good job of picking up your voice. Finally, there's access to a few very basic games on here, including Brick Breaker and Word Mole. Word Mole is kind of like filling in words with blanks in between them as they pop along, and Brick Breaker is just a very classic game where I can use the optical trackpad to navigate this bar on the side, or I can use the touchscreen itself. So that's more or less the BlackBerry Torch revisited in 2018. Surprisingly, there are still many elements of the phone that remain functional all these years later. Basic utility tools, as well as access to the browser for basic and light sites, will still render without too many problems, including access to YouTube Mobile. With that being said, this is far from a phone that you would want to use as a daily driver just because it's going to be a lot slower if you are planning on doing more complex tasks. And of course, there are many more gaps when it comes to app compatibility. You'll be far better off off with even a budget-oriented Android phone that is new today if you want the latest device and supports more social media as well as instant messaging services. With that being said, if you're looking for just a backup phone, or if you're trying to collect some older BlackBerry or nostalgic, unique handsets released in the past, this is certainly not a bad device to check out just because the price right now is at an all-time low. Again, coming in around $15, it is very low cost. The camera performs actually decently, and phone call quality, as well as the keyboard, if you want to use it for text messaging, memos, still remains functional and works well. So thanks for watching this retro look back here at OS Reviews. This has been the BlackBerry Torch Revisited 8 years later here in 2018.